it's a pleasure to follow the Noble Lord, Lord Palmer, who has given us a very useful amendment to which I was pleased to attach my name, number 52. I'm going to speak chiefly to Amendment 55, which appears in my name, but I will also look at the whole range of amendments 52 up to 55, which are all variations of forms of reports. And I think it might be useful for us to consider looking to report stage whether this is something we can bring together, because there clearly is, coming from number of different directions, a desire to see a reporting mechanism, a scrutiny mechanism going forward with regard to this bill. I will, however, just briefly comment on and commend Amendment 19 in the name of the Noble Lady Baroness Hayter, which refers to consulting with consumer interests. And I think this is particularly interesting when we look back to second reading to the comments of the Noble Lord, Lord Seeker, and the concerns about the way in which many of our professional services are failing to meet the needs both of those using them and indeed of broader society. And I think there's something very interesting and useful in that suggestion from the Noble Baroness that would be interesting to take forward. However, addressing chiefly the 52 to 55, this issue of reporting back, we've had a great deal of discussion in this committee about the complexity of this bill, the difficulty of fully understanding its impacts, and indeed the fact that with a whole range of Henry VIII powers contained within it, the fact that much of the detail will come in the later regulation on which we have very, very limited or no democratic oversight of. So I think there is a real argument for saying we need to have an assessment point, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, whatever it is, there needs to be an assessment point where this House, the other place, have a chance to really assess the impact of the bill, see where problems might have arisen and see how they might be dealt with. And I think there is an underlying issue here that addresses much more broadly the functioning of the whole UK government. And it's something that I hear very often from NGOs, from businesses, the fact that the government does things and then never assesses what the impact of what it actually did was, and assesses whether what it's doing should be changed in a different kind of way. There's a similar complaint that we often hear that the government or our structures very often fund pilot projects. Sometimes we get assessments of those pilot projects, but even when the assessment is brilliant, they never get rolled out. We have some real structural problems in the way in which the government works. And at least in a modest kind of way, if we build in an assessment reporting back process on this bill, we could perhaps set a model that could apply as standard even, let's think big, in terms of future bills for future operations of the government. But I want to come now to the precise details of Amendment 55, on which I'll mostly focus, and set out the reasons why it contains the particular reporting areas that it actually does. And before doing that, I do have to offer my thanks to the Bill Office, who offered their expert assistance in pulling this together. I wouldn't necessarily say by any means exactly what's listed here is exactly right, but I hope this is a starting point for discussion of some broader issues. So what this calls for is a report within 2 years and then regularly afterwards 5 years. And what it seeks to do is put this bill in the context of professional services and how they're actually provided. Now, we've already heard from the Noble Lord, the Minister, in outlining the bill, that skills shortages and addressing skills shortages is an important part of the aims of this bill. So element A of this amendment says, let's check to see how it's actually doing. Now, I've set out here medical, construction and food production sectors. We could argue about those. The reasons for medical, I think, are well canvassed and been much discussed by other lords. We are in a situation where there's nearly 35,000 unfilled nursing vacancies. We're in a situation where in Sheffield we're about to lose a much-loved GP surgery because it's simply impossible to find another GP partner for it. So the medical is obvious, but I would also point out, and this addresses the Noble Lord, Lord Palmer's amendment also, construction industry. I spent a great deal of time recently talking to the Federation of Master Builders, and that's particularly in the context of the hope that we will eventually have a workable retrofitting policy to greatly speed up the work of making our housing stock fit for the 21st century and the climate emergency. That is going to require an enormous amount of skills, a very high number of very highly skilled people, of which we are severely lacking. and particularly in continental Europe, where they're with passive house standards, with very high levels of building stock and building retrofit having been happening for decades, that's where the skills often exist. And Federation of Master Builders represents many small and medium-sized builders. How are they going to get those people in? What blocks or what speeding might this bill offer? Now, Clause B in this amendment addresses a point that I raised in second reading, which is we're really only addressing one side of the story here in this bill in terms of professional qualifications. We find these people are qualified to work in the UK, but will we actually let them in, even if they've jumped through the hoops to find themselves to be qualified? And I think here of the cases that we saw, particularly before the pandemic, some of these issues have been dealt with in the short term in the light of the pandemic, where we saw particularly physiotherapists and nurses who were not earning enough money to earn the right to remain in the UK even after working here for a number of years. And they were facing being forced to leave the UK while the NHS trusts that employed them were actually flying people out around the world to seek to recruit more people to fill the very posts that we were just throwing someone out from. So we were both seeing a situation where obviously the costs of recruitment are very significant, particularly international recruitment, but also we were losing the skills of people who'd been here for a number of years and who obviously have acquired knowledge and understanding of the roles they were being asked to fill in that time. So I think it's really important we look at the interaction between immigration and the professional qualification rules. Now, Clause C in this amendment looks at a broader issue and really questions an aspect of government policy, something that we've heard often from the government. We want to attract the best and brightest from around the world into the UK. What we're talking about, and something that's been going on for decades, is we are taking, again, particularly thinking of medical professionals, people from the global south, people who've very expensively been trained in countries that are grossly short on professionals themselves, and the Noble Lord of Fulks referred to this in an earlier group. We're taking people and bringing them here and not training enough people ourselves. So I think there's two sides of this, and Clause D in this amendment addresses the question of whether the demand for doctors, nurses and associated health professionals is being met by training within the UK. There's a very important figure there to be looked at and considered, but also a question of whether we are, and I'm going to, as a gesture of goodwill, I'm not going to make any reference to any ongoing debates anywhere else. I'm simply going to say that we surely have a responsibility, given how much we've drawn on the resources of the Global South in the past, to support the training of professionals in the Global South, the professionals that are urgently needed there, some professionals in which we will undoubtedly continue to see working in the UK, because one of the things I'd stress is we need to acknowledge that professionals will want to, for personal reasons, for personal development reasons, will want to move around the world. So we need to be training more than we need, because some of the people we train will go elsewhere. Some people from elsewhere will come here. We need to make sure enough people are being trained around the world. And I think particularly in the context of this bill, there's a question to be asked about what we're doing to support professional bodies around the world. Because if we think about how this bill is actually going to work, if you have someone who's registered as a professional with a professional body in another country, if that professional body is very strong, very well-resourced, has very good record keeping, then the process of us recognising them here should be very simple, because we can simply go and say to the people in that country, what have you got registered, and if that professional body is well-resourced, has the right data, has all the information we need, we know what their qualifications are, that could be a very simple process of agreement between two professional bodies. So, my Lords, that outlines how I see this amendment. I'm not saying this is the perfect solution. I obviously won't be moving it now, but I really think there's a lot more discussion needs to be done around this reporting issue. But I do want to raise one final point that addresses this and addresses quite a bit of other debate as well. And the Noble Lord the Minister has often said that the government needs the flexibility of Henry VIII clauses because it's a fast-changing world. And I've been thinking about the debate thus far, and I think we've been thinking a lot, and I have myself been thinking about people moving to the UK to provide professional services. But I think I was actually drawn to a case study that emerged a month or so back about what's been happening with the tutoring program, the national tutoring program. And it emerged that tutors as young as 17, earning as little as £1.57 an hour with an average of £3.07 an hour, were, through that national program, providing tutoring in maths for disadvantaged primary school pupils. We think about what's been happening in our medical services through necessity during the pandemic. A great deal of medical consultations are now being conducted online. There is no requirement for the person doing that. They can be literally anywhere in the world. And if we start to think about what's happened to so many professionals in the UK who've seen their employment conditions subjected to casualisation, to 0 hours contracts, I'm thinking here of a lot of university lecturers, we're seeing how professional services, how professionals are employed has changed enormously. And I really would suggest to your Lordship's House we need to think about how that's going to play out differently in the context of this bill.